I think it's a really interesting moment in time for you to be here, Norman. And I was thinking quite a lot about kind of Black History Month, what that means to our city. And I think we are pretty, as a city, we're cultural, we're pretty creative. We still have a real sense of community. And we do actually reintroduce, as part of a team that reintroduced Black History Month a couple of years ago. But having said that, in the light of what's happened recently, what happened in Southport last year, and the riots, I don't know why I do that with earmarks, but that kind of kicked off, I think you're in a really interesting place in the UK. We have the oldest Black community in Europe, biggest Chinese arch outside of China, and essentially we are built off slave trade. And to see the current narrative that's happening at the moment, I just think as a city we should know better and we should do better. And it's quite an interesting moment in time for you to be here, because we have a really rich, quite difficult history. And we'll go and have a little look round and you can see some of those faces. But I think really for me, I did quite a lot of work in a previous job archiving the 1919 race riots and the 81 uprisings that happened in Liverpool. And the area that we're in right now kind of marks the end of Toxteth. So you said this to me a few times, L8. And it's kind of like well known, isn't it? Toxteth, Brixton.
Yeah, absolutely.
Where is it in Bristol? I can't think.
St Paul's.
Yeah.
The hotbeds, Moss Side, they're all hotbeds.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm really...
Handsworth.
Yeah. And like I live in Toxteth, I'm an L8 girl. I'm not from Toxteth originally, but I'm really proud to say I live in Toxteth. And I think it got a bit of a bad reputation. But if you look back, and I'll show you some of it today, it kind of, I think people know about the slave trade. We've got the Slavery Museum on Liverpool, and I have to credit us, we're one of the few cities that actually have a museum. It's getting redone at the minute because it doesn't have great prominence, but
Redone's better than closed.
Yeah. But we do have that, and I think what a lot of people don't know about is the 1919 race riots.
Yeah.
And they happened all over the UK, and it's really quite specific. If you think about it, for that moment in time, post-war. So we had a lot of Caribbeans, particularly, but Africans as well, from the Commonwealth and the British Empire come over and fight. And kind of what happened to that group of people, I don't think is as well documented as the 81 uprisings. Yeah. And it's a huge part of our history here in Liverpool. So we kind of how it... I told you the story about how we got the archive, didn't I?
No, but before you do that,
yeah,
I think what you've identified for me was that there is an era, a very concentrated era of immigration before Windrush. But yeah, you're right, it isn't very well documented. And it would be interesting to find out whether it actually ever subsided or whether it was always continuing until we got to the Windrush era, because we're only talking about a difference of maybe 50 years.
Yeah, no.
So, I think that's something that, as a project, we could definitely look at in the future, or we need to, in terms of just being able to understand the narrative that is in play today.
Well, and you think about Liverpool's really intrinsic in that history. So the university was the first to coin the term half-caste.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And the treatment, because there was a lot of black seafarers that came to and settled in Liverpool, and they married predominantly white working class females, so they had quite a lot of mixed race children. And you'll notice that in Toxteth there's a huge mixed race population, but the way that they were spoken about was kind of it's unbelievable to go back and read it. And yet I think because we are a port city and it's similar to the Bristols, to the Cardiff, to the London, there was always a constant migration coming in and out of the city. also, don't forget the Dockers. You know, there was a huge influence from America. We had blues music come over. Beatles credit that that's where they got their style from, black American music.
Right.
And you had all these seafarers going over to New York, coming back with all the best clothes, the best vinyl, you know, all this new records, all these, and they kind of really credited for bringing that into our country, not just our city. So musically, were hugely influenced by black culture, majorly, and the Little Richards of the world was a huge influence. And I did a project around that actually about the music culture, but that's another thing around Windrush. But the 1919 race rights, why it kind of sticks with me, and I find it really difficult. I work for a charity called Writing on the Wall, and this guy Joe Farag, who's like a community activist in Toxteth, he does a lot around the Granby, really important, and he just turned up with
And what is the Granby?
So the Granby is in off Prinny Ave, which is where the 81 uprisings happened. There are lots of little streets, and a lot of them became derelict. And the Granby Street kind of came together as a community to rebuild this one street, Granby Street. They won the Turner Art Prize for it. Yeah. It was a really big. It was and then off the result of that, there's quite a lot of activity on Granby Street, because there always has been on Princes Avenue. And now they have like a monthly market where they're all kind of local sellers. It's gorgeous. Next time you're up, we'll have to go. And he turned up with like just those kind of old metal drawers from the council. Like there must have been about 20 of them, I think. And inside them was all documentations of black ex-servicemen who'd fought in the First World War, and post the war they'd come back to extreme poverty. Not only had they fight for country and queen, that's what they'd been told. They then came back to the UK, settled here, and not all of them came for that reason. A lot of them were already settled in Liverpool before the war started. And they were living in extreme poverty, like unbelievable. And they weren't actually based in Toxteth, they were more in L1 by the Chinese Arch particularly. That's now a large Chinese community, and the black community's been moved up to Toxteth. But there's letters in this archive from black ex-servicemen or seafarers who are writing to the Lord Mayor to say, look, we can't continue like this. The Lord Mayor then writes to the Home Office and basically says we've got a black problem. The Home Office writes back to the Lord Mayor of Liverpool saying send them back to Africa with £5. Get rid of them.
So what numbers are we talking about in terms of those who returned from?
You're talking a couple of thousand in Liverpool, I would imagine. I'm not. Don't quote me on that. I'm not 100% sure. I know through the archive we were able to work with 5 families and trace their families, and kind of really start to think about this kind of forgotten history. And then in 1919, on a random evening, a fight broke out in a pub, kind of down by Chinatown. And it was actually we had quite a lot of Norwegian, I think, seafarers who lived here. And someone was either seriously injured or killed, I'm not sure, but basically what had happened, they blamed this Bermudan black lad called Charles Wotton. And somehow over the course of the evening, the fight takes place in the pub. Someone names Charles Wotton, who turns out that he wasn't there. He wasn't even at the fight. And a mob, a racist mob, turned up, and they reckon it was anywhere between 300 to 1,000 people. So you can imagine as you're walking down the streets what that would have looked like in 1919.
Yeah.
You wouldn't have had the light, you wouldn't have had all of you'd have had smog, all of that. And they chased him right down to the dock. And he, on his death record, he says he drowned, but he was definitely...
set upon?
Yeah, 100%. And that then, what's really interesting about that is that then sparked a series of race riots across the UK. And I think when the uprisings happened in 81, you could communicate more, so they were much more linked, but these were almost happening in silo, which is telling you about what racial tensions were happening then in 1919, that these kind of, all the port cities, Bristol, Cardiff had riots, London had a riot, and they were kind of happening almost in silo to each other.
But isn't it I've noticed a pattern that, and we could go back to 2010, where there seems to be the same pattern that goes on back into the early 80s. Silo disturbances don't seem to happen in the UK. If it's going to happen, it's going to happen en masse, and it travels. Why do you think that might be the case?
In 1919, I think you've got ostracised communities. You're not, even though I would say that's still happening a lot now, they were really held. You know, you had the Caribbean, Black African communities, you had the Chinese communities, and no one mixed at all. Whereas when you look at Toxteth now, you've got nationalities from all over the globe. It's very diverse. And I think that you know, they were race riots because no one was coming to the black community's aid. No one was stepping in. There was no camaraderie. They were othered. And so I think it's really telling that clearly this had been bubbling up under the surface for so long throughout the war. You know, that it was happening before the war, but then, you know, giving your life and then coming back to being told that you're not wanted anymore.
It's a huge slap in the face.
Yeah, and kind of how isolating that must have been, to then kind of, I think that they just had enough, and actually the conditions they were living in, unbelievable. So I think it was communities on their own just saying enough is enough. Which is quite interesting when you look at the 81 uprisings, because we call that an uprising. Well, if you've worked with me for long enough, it's drilled into me that it's an uprising, not a race riot. It was a riot, but why? One, they choose to call it the uprisings, but two, because it was a really diverse community in Toxteth at the time. So whilst we know that it was the brutality, you know, it was Leroy Cooper being arrested that's credited for the kick-off in Toxteth, and we knew it was police brutality against our black communities, it was actually the whole entire community, white, brown, black, all coming together against the police brutality. So they call it an uprising. And if you're lucky enough, the likes of Pat, one of the nans from the uprising, she's still knocking about as a huge activist, kind of how important that moment in time was for the community to come together.
Quick question.
Go on.
So you jump from the 1910 riot to the 1981 uprising. Where was the changing moment in the psychology of the communities? When did the silo positioning became a much more integrated pushback?
I think that was happening from that. So from the early 1900s, you had, like I said to you about the university, you had people settling here. You had black communities, largely Caribbean. Charles Woodman was Bermudan. And you had that mix of community, so you're starting to see people kind of settling, largely in the South End, but kind of a lot more mixed race families, a lot more kind of, not segregation, what's the other way, where people are kind of coming together. Integration. I don't know, I couldn't think of that word. So I think, and you're talking about 50, 60 year period, people no longer like, this is our city. It became very much no, we're here, we've been here, and it's not just, they weren't just first generation Caribbeans or Africans, they talk about second, third Caribbean, so they were rooted here. And I think Toxteth particularly as well, because there was a lot of interracial relationships and a lot of real sense of community. I think also, you know, you've got to look at the 70s. Liverpool and Merseyside has been for a really long time one of the poorest boroughs, so they had nothing already. So you weren't talking about you were talking about whole entire communities coming together against poverty, against kind of political disadvantage that they were seeing. And then Thatcher came, which made it even worse.
Which is a real good, I think, a real good way of segueing in maybe a model of inclusion, in the sense of a lot of those families from the 1910 era had children that went to school and mixed also. So those who were part of the pushback and the uprising in the 80s may well have been the grandchildren of and have kind of travelled through this whole... I grew up in a similar environment up in Limehouse in East London,
Right.
which is right by the docks, and it was completely populated by every group you could think of, and the houses that we lived in were all named after Caribbean islands. So you had St Lucia House, St Christopher House, Jamaica House, you know, and within there was the whole Commonwealth and beyond.
Yeah.
And with what I experienced as a child was I didn't know prejudice. You know, I didn't know prejudice until I watched Roots on the TV. I still didn't know what prejudice was on my day-to-day. You know, so I would hang out with the Pakistani family over here, and we'd knock for our Chinese friend over there, and we would play football with our Jamaican friends over here, and we had the Nigerians over there, and we were just kids. We just mixed, and I can see that being part of a body of resistance. But also, Liverpool seems to have, I call a lot of places the People's Republic of this and that, I have my moments. But I do kind of see Liverpool seeing itself as something slightly different to the rest of the UK. And if we talk about all of those anniversaries that we covered in terms of the black community's evolution within, and then you throw into it Hillsborough. And then, can we say at the end of that decade, Liverpool looks at itself, looks around the UK and realises it is different?
Yeah, and also don't forget post Hillsborough, you then had the 90s, don't forget the Dockers strike in the early 90s was a huge, and they lost the Dockers strike, the Dockers didn't win, but parts of that was a huge... I find this quite an interesting topic because I'm always proud to say I'm from Liverpool. I never say I'm English, I say I'm Scouse. That's changing for me, and I feel like when you go to places like Liverpool, Glasgow, other really working class cities, but particularly Liverpool, there's a huge sense of community that's still here, whether that's good or bad. I think what's happening at the minute in Liverpool is you've got a north-south divide, which has always kind of been the case.
Is that economically driven, or is it culturally driven?
Culturally driven, I reckon. So, I mean, Merseyside as a whole is a very, very poor county. Has been, used to be the poorest in the whole entire of Europe. But what you had was, you'd have the dock, and a lot of our kind of diverse black Asian communities were settling in the south end of the city.
Right.
And you'll see that where Chinatown is now, and then they're getting pushed further and further south as that's gentrified. But what then you had on the north end was a lot of the Irish community, and then a lot of white working class. So I feel like there's quite a big race divide between the north end, so Fazakerley, where Old Course is, all up that way. If you've ever heard of Bootle, very white working class communities, and then you come down to Toxteth, the Dingle, even Aigburth, becoming more and more diverse. Kensington, very different to the Kensington you've got in London. And I think we're right to be divided. I think the poverty, I think with the levels of poverty and access in Liverpool, there's an undercurrent, and there's a huge thing if you go into the north end of the city at the minute, there's flags everywhere. And I'm like, do you know your history?
And that's the amazing thing, because I imagined that these community traumas, these episodes, impacted on everybody who was working class. That's what I'm thinking that geographically the spread is so small. How could it not? Might be wrong. I wasn't there.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting moment in time, and I'm really glad that you come up and you're such a supporter of Liverpool and kind of the work that we do up here. I think what's really interesting is that there is a real moment of kind of unrest, and I think for me, and I might be wrong, some of it is around loss of identity. Some of it is around this idea that class doesn't exist anymore. And I think that's really dangerous because we are a working class city.
Yeah.
And therefore we will never have the same opportunity. But it's that people are looking for connection, they're looking for community, they're looking for this sense of belonging. Unfortunately, what is happening for me, and that you might disagree with it, is when you're lost and you're out there are groups who are quite extreme who will ask you to come in and come and be part of that. And we see it in the work with the prisons, around masculinity and men, but I think it's really happening much wider than that around kind of race and this idea of a sense of belonging, because this whole British, be British. We're an island.
Exactly.
And quoting the famous Evertonian song, even though I'm a Red, if you know your history, do you know what I mean? And just that, we should be so proud.
Indeed.
Of our history of migration.
Well, just to add to that, while we're in musical mode, Bob Marley sang, "If you know your history, you know where you're coming from." So we're not that dissimilar. But I've been, in the last couple of weeks, I've been to, allegedly, Bedford, which has been labelled as the most racist town in the UK. And I've walked the streets of Toxteth and LA very recently. And as a man of colour walking around these communities, I didn't feel that I was out of place. I didn't feel like I was under threat. I didn't feel that. Now, I'm not saying the experiences of others aren't validated, but I do question the media and its models of reporting and the way that it is promoting a psyche of being displaced. Because unless you're on the ground walking around, you can't really gauge what's happening out there. And I think there's a time, we talk about identity, or you mentioned identity, I think we've come to the end of an era where it's been defined by others for us. I think what is actually happening is with that, I feel that, and this is based on just my walk-arounds, we now have to understand that we are much more inclusive and much more tied together than we ever were told we are.